Thanks a lot, Stuart. Before introducing our guest speaker today, I want to take a moment to thank Dr. Matthew Rowlinson, whose constant encouragement has made the inception of this group possible from the beginning. Also, Dr. Mary Helen McMurran's relentless support has enabled us to sustainably organize events as today's talk. I also want to take a moment to thank Dr. Jason Sander. Thanks for coming today. Dr. William Turkle, all the graduate students from Western, as well as the other universities who have been active members of this group. And of course, all of you who are present here and all of who will be watching the recording later, who send their apologies for not being here today. On that note, it is my privilege today to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Jonathan Saha. Dr. Saha is Associate Professor of South Asian History at Durham University. He specializes in the history of 19th and 20th century colonialism in Southeast Asia, focusing particularly on British Burma. His 2013 monograph, Law, Disorder, and the Colonial State, looked at the history of corruption within the colonial state, exploring how the state was experienced and imagined in everyday life. His second book, Colonizing Animals, which came out in 2021, explores how British imperialism in Myanmar, Burma, transformed relationships between humans and animals in the colony. Dr. Saha is also a member of the editorial collective of the History Workshop Journal and is the editor for the Empire's Other Histories series, published by Bloomsbury. Dr. Saha has finished an independent social research foundation mid-career fellowship on the topic of accumulation and empire, a project that explored the utility of the conception of accumulation for better interrogating the imperial past. He's co-chair of the Royal Historical Society's Race, Equality and Ethnicity Working Group and a co-author of its 2018 report. So once again, welcome all of you, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Saha.
Thank you very much, Raj, and thank you, Stuart. Thank you both for inviting me to speak to everybody. I'm just going to share my screen, which hopefully should be pretty straightforward. Can everyone see that okay? Smashing. So I'm going to talk to you for a bit today, hopefully not try your patience too much. And what I'm going to try and do is tell you a little bit about some of the core arguments of my book, and use this talk to pivot from the arguments which I was making there to where some of my research is going in the future, which is to think about racial capitalism as it manifested itself in colonial Myanmar. Now, I realize that today I'm speaking to a group who are predominantly interested in the animal studies side of what my work is doing. So I want to give a little bit of an outline of the history of colonial Myanmar to help situate yourselves. So Myanmar was colonized by Britain through 3 wars during the 19th century, and the bulk of the country was brought into the Indian Empire after 1885. It was then governed by British India until 1937, when it was separated out and given its own independent, well, not independent, sorry, its own status within the British Empire, and then became independent in 48. Between 42 and 44, it was ruled by an occupying Japanese government. So that's a very quick overview of what happens there. You'll get a bit more detail about the nature of colonialism in Myanmar as we go through. Now, my book, Colonizing Animals, one of its core arguments is to develop this notion of interspecies empire. And I wanted to tell you a little bit what I mean by that, because I realize it's not a self-evident term. Now, imperialism in Myanmar, but more widely across British India, has rarely been understood as something that is constituted through the role of animals. And one of the ways that what I wanted to move the study of colonial Myanmar was by bringing the role of animals into our understanding of it as a central element of what's happening there. So part of the talk of, or the concept of interspecies empire, is to better acknowledge that empire was not a human formation alone. On the other hand, the history of animals has not always been attuned to or alive to the importance of imperialism. More precisely, though, because there is some work that has started to build in that area, animal studies and animal history more precisely has not always been attuned to the roles played by colonized peoples in their relationships with animals, particularly in histories of colonial Asia. So my framing of interspecies empire is to pinpoint the relationships that were established between animals and colonized humans in colonialism. So the new relationships which were forged through the British Empire, in particular for my work, and its impacts on Myanmar. But also not just looking at the new novel relationships that emerged out of those that encounter, but to pay attention to the changes in pre-existing relationships between humans and animals in the colonial world. So not to take the colonial moment as being inherently sort of generative of modern relationships, but trying to think of it more as something which is transforming pre-existing social mores and cultures as well. So historiographically, that's why I talk about things in terms of interspecies empire. It is also something of a corrective for studies that tend to focus on single species. And instead of trying to shift us into looking at, say, just elephants or just cattle, what I'm trying to suggest is that when we bring animals into the history of empire, what we might actually be looking at is a series of different relationships between different species, and trying to keep in mind the shifts that occur and the different histories that are required for different types of species. So in my book, there are two different areas in which I really try and draw out the ways in which human-animal relationships, particularly the relationships between colonized humans and animals, shifts during the colonial period, either new things being integrated or changes in pre-existing relationships. And the first one which I identify is the transformations that occur when animals become forms of capital. Now, in colonial Myanmar, there were two major economic industries that really developed in new ways in the late 19th century as a result of the intervention of British rule. One of the key ones in that is the timber industry, particularly teak extraction. Now, within that industry, elephants and the mobilization of elephant labor is essential to not only the practice of extracting teak and the labor processes of that industry, but it was essential to European timber firms getting a competitive edge over smaller Burmese rivals. And the reason for that is, by the late 19th century, easily extractable teak has diminished to the point where timber firms are having to go deeper into Burmese forests in order to be able to identify, find, extract, and plant teak fields. In order to go further into the forests to discover and extract this teak, timber firms need to require substantial elephant populations to do this. There is no better technology at this time for exploring the forests. There is no logistical means of getting there that is better than an elephant at this point, and there is no force that is more capable of maneuvering teak through the forests, down the rivers, out of the rivers, and then being processed and stacked and put onto ships in ports in the south of Myanmar than elephants. At all stages of that process, they are essential to it. Now, the cost of mobilizing an elephant workforce and the amount of capital that is spent on generating a working herd effectively means that small Burmese timber firms are pushed out of the industry because they can't command the capital which is necessary to acquire elephants at that scale. So the transformation of elephants who have been doing this type of work, but at a much smaller scale, throughout most of Burmese, certainly since the 12th centuries, elephants have moved from this type of work. They've been doing this type of work, extracting timber, being involved in the construction, being involved in external shipments of timber prior to this. But now there's a new market that they're operating within and a new scale. So if we look at sort of around 1910, the largest European timber firm extracting teak is the Bombay Burma Trading Corporation that employs at this time around 1,000 working elephants. By the time we get to 1930s, in the late 1930s, the Bombay Burma Trading Corporation alone is employing around 3,000 elephants. And the estimates for the number of working elephants in Myanmar by 1942 range from 7,000 to 10,000. And the difference between those estimates seems to be whether or not those individuals include the captive calf population. So we're talking about a large number and a huge increase in working elephants in this time. And it's likely that by the 1930s, the working elephant population now exceeds the wild population in the country. So that shift is particularly pronounced when we consider that the working elephant population cannot reproduce themselves from their own herds for a bunch of reasons, which I could get into, but I won't do now for reasons of time. And so there is an uneven relationship between the working population and the wild population, and a extractive relationship between the two. So this is just one example of how a particular species in Myanmar has become increasingly dependent upon particular industries, particular arrangements and flows of capital for its own perpetuation as a species in the country. And we can see this right through to today, where limits or restrictions on the timber industry has had immediate effect of questioning what happens to the working elephant population, which would no longer be employed in that industry, but also would struggle to be released into the wild. And since that population is the largest demographic of Asian elephants in Myanmar, the fate of those working elephants is intimately tied to the fate of the survival of that species in in the country itself. Now, alongside elephants, the other main species that become essential as working elephants in Myanmar are cattle, particularly oxen, but to a lesser extent, buffalo. Now, quite different to the extractive timber industry, these animals were mostly employed in the rice industry. Now, the rice industry was a peasant-led expansion, and the rice boom from the 1850s through to the 1920s, although is definitely showing signs of ailing at this point, was built off the back of Burmese peasants migrating from the north to the southern delta regions and cultivating previously uncultivated land, producing rice that then could be sold on the world market. Now, alongside a huge number of humans, 4 million oxen migrate from upper regions of Myanmar to the delta region in this time. And they are essential for plow power, they're essential for fertilizer, and they're also essential for transportation in these regions. Now, their cost goes up during the rice boom, and peasants are largely borrowing extensively in order to acquire oxen for plow power. Now, this indebtedness is one of the principal weaknesses in the expansion of the rice industry, and one of the reasons why peasants remain extremely precarious and ultimately end up in a position of many of them foreclosing on mortgages, or finding mortgages foreclosed on them, I should say, and losing their land to Burmese and Indian moneylenders, particularly from 1930 onwards, when the Great Depression sees the price of rice halve. Now, as a working animal that the Burmese peasantry was intimately connected to, the vulnerabilities, the bodily vulnerabilities of cattle were a cause of considerable concern. Now, we'll come to some of the perceived threats that were there for cattle later in the talk, but two primary ones I wanted to identify immediately was disease, rindpest, being a global threat at this point to the peasantry, to cattle, but also the threat of wild creatures, particularly crocodiles and tigers. So whilst we see the commoditization of the bodies of oxen in order to supply the need of cultivators in the Burma Delta, we see a simultaneous incentivization through the establishment of bounties and rewards, monetary bounties and rewards, of killing predator species. And so, in tandem with the sort of valorization of Burmese cattle, we have the incentivization of the eradication of these other creatures, similarly through the effect of trying to create a market in the eradication and extinction of crocodiles and tigers, and snakes as well, although that is less successful. My point in just raising this here is to illustrate the ways that the commodification of certain creatures has knock-on effects on creating market incentives for killing creatures that threaten them. And so the construction of animal capital is a much wider process than just those that are useful to particular labor processes, and has knock-on effects beyond those. We might also pick up on something like the colonial states' attempts to produce game laws and preserve certain types of species through conservation activities, and how much that process is also predicated upon market incentives, so fines and licenses as being the key elements of how the colonial state tries to manage this. That was one part of the interspecies empire study that I looked at, the way that creatures and their relationships with humans were increasingly defined by a market society logic, as well as by capital. Now, the other side of this that I look into is the emergence of and the prominent role of animals in anti-colonial struggles in colonial Myanmar, something which animal history had largely been blind to in most of its work. I could talk about this at substantial length, but I won't. What I'll rather just is to give you a quick example of that, which is this text that I've put up here, which is the Meow Tika or Monkey Tika. Now, a Tika is supposed to be a Buddhist religious commentary. In this case, it's written by a journalist, poet, and radical nationalist called Thakin Kodol Mine, although in this case he's writing under the pseudonym Mr. Mount Mine. Now, as the sort of play on the use of an English title in Mr. Mount Mine suggests, there is a lot of parody in this particular text. And the bit which I was particularly interested in is where he offers a natural history of various species of ape and monkey. And in this, he does all sorts of really interesting things. I mean, first of all, he is drawing on Western writings and scientific literature on animals. I should point out this is published in 1923. And then translating those ideas and concepts into Burmese for a Burmese audience and readership. There's around 2,000, a print run of this is around 2,000 issues, and was priced at such a level that it could have been bought by moderately salaried Burmese people, likely in Yangon. So it had something of a wider readership. So first of all, he's playing with and introducing Western scientific ideas into a Burmese cultural context, and in a format that, as I've already suggested, is not typical for Western scientific ideas necessarily to be translated in, which is that of a Buddhist commentary. He also uses these Western scientific writings to critique and satirize colonial society in Myanmar itself. One of my favorite little passages in there is where he talks about the Pluto monkey and describes how its haircut is similar to what you might find on a European man in Myanmar, and describes the sideburns and the fringe that you might see on this monkey to illustrate his description of them. And what I think is interesting in this is this way that he's subverting and playing with the notion of Burmese people being evolutionarily behind European people by drawing a proximity between Europeans and these monkeys. Now, it's really hard to overstate how important Thakin Kodol Mine is to Burmese nationalism, both at this time, but right way through into the 1960s. He's a really fundamental literary figure and political actor in this time. And the Monkey Tika is just one of a number of different tikas that he writes during the 1920s and 30s, and several of which are focused on animals. There is the dog tikka, there is also the peacock tikka, and both of these are really important in emphasizing the symbolic but also material importance of animals to Burmese nationalism. In both of those texts, there is a sort of ethology that he devises based on his experience and interactions with these two different species, the dogs and peacocks, that he then uses to build critiques of either other Burmese nationalists or to try and use animals as either exemplary characters for understanding how Burmese people should be behaving. So offering moral stories through those behaviors of those animals. So animals are actually quite interesting and central to Burmese nationalism in a variety of ways. So that's an outline of two of the key arguments of the book. So far, I've not really said anything about racial capitalism, and you'll probably notice I've been talking for quite a long time. Where I'm going to is to try and think about racial capitalism as something that might bring through and join together these two areas of my argument, both the emergence of animal capital as central to restructuring human relationships with animals and the importance of animals in the emergence of Burmese nationalism. I'm going to say a little bit about that now. In short, I think there are three interlinked processes that we might see happening, particularly in the early 19th century. Firstly, the commodification of animals, particularly animal bodies. And here I'm talking particularly, but not exclusively, about the commodifications of animals as they're alive, as living entities, and their capacities as living entities. Secondly, there is the racialization of human animals that is also happening mostly from the late 19th century within sort of colonial discourse and rhetoric, but something that becomes an increasingly prominent part of Burmese nationalism in the 1920s and 1930s. And finally, the emergence of a market society that by the early 20th century has become ingrained and to the point of being foundational to how the majority of people, indigenous people living within Myanmar, it's now been fundamental to how they can reproduce themselves socially. Subsistence farming that isn't based on a market has become increasingly marginal to the point of being predominantly operating only in the upland areas of Myanmar, and even there being increasingly undermined by the emergence of extractive industries like the teak industry that I've already discussed. So these three interlinked processes are where I think racial capitalism might be really useful to explore. It might be worth pausing briefly to say something about how I'm using racial capitalism here. The term itself is something that has emerged from a tradition of Black radical writing, and was identified firstly by the thinker and radical historian Cedric Robinson, writing in Black Marxism. Now, there is a tension in the term racial capitalism. At its sort of bare bones level, what it's trying to do is explore the ways in which capitalism and racialization were processes which were interlinked. Now, some have taken this to be a more overarching theoretical exploration of the way that capitalism and racialization may be mutually dependent upon one another in a variety of ways. I'm not using it in that particular way. I'm trying to use it more as just like as an analytical lens to explore the ways that capitalism and racialization may intersect at various points. I'm not trying to put forward any claim to how those two might be more widely or conceptually tied to one another. I think the term racial capitalism suffers a little bit from being a term that both connotes an approach to understanding racialization and capitalism, but also a term that aspires to be capturing an actual historical process. So the historical process and the approach are being named by racial capitalism in a way that is sometimes unhelpful. What I'm trying to use it as more is an analytical lens. So hopefully that adds some clarity to what I mean by racial capitalism in this context. You can see it playing out in a few different areas. I'm going to focus on one. I've already talked about the importance of cattle in the expansion of the rice industry. What I didn't talk about was the way that cattle themselves come to be indigenized in both colonial discourses and nationalist discourses. And this is done through the sense that there is a Burmese breed of cattle, which is distinct and separate to Indian cattle that is imported into Myanmar. Now, they are both the same species. There may have been some bodily differences between the cattle which was imported to some of the indigenous cattle, but this is likely to have been quite subtle and not particularly pronounced, particularly as many cattle came over the border with what is today Bangladesh, which was then Bengal, and would have moved across that border very fluidly for centuries prior to this. But here you can see some images taken from a report into stock cattle published in 1928, by which time this fear of the Indian breed of cattle intermixing and crossbreeding with Burmese cattle, reducing the quality of Burmese stock of oxen because they were perceived to be weaker than Burmese cattle. You can see this image here that is supposed to illustrate the ill effects of crossbreeding. On the left-hand side, you have a young Burmese bull, purebred, and on the right-hand side, you have the evil effects of crossing and a crossbred cow. What you might not be able to see quite so clearly is attending both of these creatures is a different human, racialized as in the first image as a Burmese man, and in the second as an Indian man. Now, all the interventions which were made to try and restrict the movement of Indian cattle were coterminous with legislation to try and restrict the movement of Indian humans. Concerns about vaccinations and trying to vaccinate bulls, well, all cattle against tuberculosis, again, and whilst trying to vaccinate Indians against smallpox, were similarly going on at the same time and had the same set of racial connotations and concerns about religious practice. These two things are running side by side. What's interesting is the way that this then gets incorporated into Burmese nationalist rhetoric and discourses, to the point where in the Sayasan uprising that happens in 1930 that I alluded to earlier when I talked about the Great Depression and the effects of the Great Depression, in that uprising, you do have a series of attacks against Indian cattle herders. And it's very difficult to explain those particular sets of massacres that occur without understanding the way that racial discourses, economic concerns, and the particular importance of oxen to the peasantry is unpacked. So here we can see this process of the commodification of oxen occurring at the same time as a set of racialized discourses about Indians emerging in colonial Myanmar. Another example of the way that racialization and the commoditization of animals was operating in tandem would be to look at the elephant drivers and the recruitment of elephant drivers in the timber industry. Now, a lot of the writings on the timber industry, either by people engaged in the industry at the time, but also subsequently in a lot of this sort of more popular writings around the Burmese teak industry and Burmese elephants, holds this view of there being a sort of long tradition of elephant driving within particular communities in Myanmar, such as the Kachin or Shan or Karen communities who live in the upland regions in the borders of Myanmar. Now, whilst that is true, and there is a long history of these communities working with elephants, the massive expansion in the number of working elephants suggests that there's something more going on in this time period of a larger number of people being brought into this line of work. And the transfer of knowledge, embodied knowledge and cultural knowledge about working with and taming and living with alongside elephants, to move from a relatively small number of working elephants to around 10,000 working elephants would have required a huge knowledge transfer going on within those communities, and a huge shift in economic specialization within those communities as they moved into this more niche area of employment. And there is all sorts of evidence you can find within the Bombay Burma Trading Corporation for their particular reliance on these communities. They are constantly analyzing the varying costs of labor in these areas, and they become largely dependent upon their ability to recruit elephant drivers from these communities, to the point where in the Saha Rebellion, again, to pick up a particular tension point in race relations in Myanmar, the timber industry, European timber industry, is so concerned that the colonial state is unable to protect their interests that they rely on their connections with these communities to mobilize their own forms of defenses, including using elephants as potential fighters, although not many of them saw action, but nonetheless they mobilize elephants to engage the peasant rebels and to try and fight them off. This image I've took here is taken from a book called Elephant Bill by a very prominent, well-known European who worked in the timber industry in Myanmar. And the caption I'll read out now as well: inseparable. This young Uzi is almost part of his animal. They are both about the same age, 21. He is a Shan with a pale copper skin, and the elephant has pink edges to its ears, trunk, contrasting with its blue-black hide. This romanticization and this sort of naturalization of the relationship between a particular human and particular species of animal connected to them is very typical of the colonial discourse around this time. And I think it really helps capture the relationship we have going on here between racialization and the commoditization of animals, because the animal here as a working creature that has been compelled to work in the labor process, and the Uzi, this case is Shan individual, this elephant driver, and his place as a wage laborer, have both been obscured by the romanticization of this particular image. So hopefully you can see in these two brief examples the commodification of animals, the racialization of humans, and the underpinning emergence of market society as being essential to what's going on there. So that's where I'm going to round up. This is something I'm still continuing to work on, and there are other areas in which we can see racial capitalism emerging through the commoditization of animals. But I wanted to end by pointing out something important that my book also makes an argument for, but I think is illustrated and underlined here, that even though we are bringing animals in, or I'm bringing animals into the history of imperialism alongside subalternized human populations, we cannot treat those two groups as experiencing colonialism in the same way, and nor were they experiencing the same effects of colonialism. So what we see here is animals themselves becoming commodities, but humans having their labor commoditized as something alienable from themselves. Their labor power is something which they sell. We are seeing animals being understood in terms of their ethology and in terms of increasingly new natural historical and zoological knowledges that are attempting to bridge some of the gaps between human understandings and animal understandings in order to make these animals more pliable to the particular labor processes that they're involved in. Whereas we are seeing humans being increasingly segmented by racial divisions that allow them to be confined more or less into particular niches within the labor market. So there we're having small differences between humans being emphasized to separate humans from animals, humans from other humans in order to justify divisions within colonial society. Whereas when we look at animals, what we're seeing are attempts to bring animals in to human societies in ways in which they can be dominated. So being attuned to the way that racial capitalism is playing out and the role that animals are playing within that, I think helps us to have more sophisticated understandings of how colonized humans and animals are being incorporated and changed and transformed, and their relationships between them being transformed in the colonial moment. So that's where I'm going to end. I ran on a bit longer than I'd hoped to, but hopefully we have some time for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Saha. That was an excellent talk. I think we have a couple of questions to begin with. Looks like, oh, sorry, no, maybe those were hand raises. Okay. People just cogitating on what you've just said, maybe. Alex, go ahead.
I'm afraid I can't hear you, Alex.
Oh, can you hear me now? Cool. Okay. Yeah. So I just want to say thank you for that presentation, Dr. Saha. It was really interesting to hear a bit more about the relationship between colonialism and elephants in Myanmar. And I guess one of my questions is, and I don't know if you maybe uncovered this in your research, but it was like a very historical basis. And I imagine that is the main scope. And so I'm curious to know now what you see as some of the biggest issues when it comes to elephant populations within Asia and the relationship to humans. Logging is a lot less of a major concern now. Often it is around elephant in use in tourism, right? Like that's typically now where we're seeing a lot of concerns around animal well-being, especially elephants when it comes to like trekking and things of this nature. Definitely logging still exists. But yeah, I'm curious to know what you found as some of the major concerns, and what are some potentially environmentally sound solutions to deal with these rising concerns through either like better treatment of animals or through like community-based approaches to handle this increasing tension.
Thanks, Alex. I think Myanmar might be a bit of an outlier in comparison to Thailand and and India, where most of the working animals are still employed in logging. Like vast majority of the 5,000 working animals in Myanmar are still employed in logging. Tourism comes into this in the sense that, first of all, there is some theft and smuggling of animals for the tourist industry in Thailand. But also tourism is figured as an alternative to logging, particularly as restrictions on logging were coming in before the military coup happened last year. Now that shift, that pivot, which was supposed to happen from logging to tourism, was always flawed from the beginning. One of the things about the logging industry in Myanmar is that, relatively speaking, the welfare of Burmese elephants was much higher than in Nepal and India and in Thailand, because they are semi-captive. I mean, it's a poor phrase, semi-captive. They are still captive, but they're allowed certain amounts of roaming, and the level of veterinary care was much higher than elsewhere. That said, the conditions was not good. It was not good for an elephant to be kept in any of those types of conditions, but comparatively it was better. Tourism just did not demand the same number of elephants as logging does in Myanmar. And so it was never a meaningful shift. And the tourism industry in Myanmar was never that sustainable in the first place. So those are the problems. The problems really are facing how do we manage the decline of a logging industry, which is unsustainable in Myanmar, but is necessary currently for the perpetuation of that species in the country. Now, there was some recently in the Journal of Animal Sentience, a really interesting set of debates about rewilding elephants, and the potentially importance of rewilding elephants for ecological recovery more widely, as ecosystem engineers. And that debate has influenced me quite a lot about the prospects of rewilding. And some of the research on Myanmar suggests that the biggest obstacles to rewilding from local populations are not inherent to clashes between humans, particularly peasants and animals and elephants. They're more about poverty. So the greater level of poverty, the more clashes there are likely to be or likely are. And so my argument that I draw through at the end of the book in thinking about why is animal history important is that when you consider the different but related problems facing humans, subalternized human groups, and animals that are confined or otherwise being sort of subjected to oppressive conditions, when you're attentive to the differences and connections between their forms of oppression, then you can come up with political platforms that are more inclusive for both. And in this case, poverty alleviation is essential to any program of rewilding. Now, one of the interesting things is this may seem like a sort of romantic political stance, but if we look at say, some of the ethnic minority regions in the east of Myanmar, particularly those around the Karen populations, there has long been a movement for sort of indigenous forest management and stewardship of ecologies connected to the political demands for indigenous rights and political recognition for ethnic minority groups. And so actually with that connective political demand is already there in indigenous groups in Myanmar, particularly in the Kayen communities. So I don't think actually it is a completely fanciful sort of demand, but one which is connected there, which brings in this extra level of it, which was there in this animal sentience debate. A guy called Nicholas Lane, who's a French anthropologist of human and elephant relationships, who argues that we really need to be decolonial in being attentive to those ethnic minority groups who are attending to elephants and making sure that their knowledges and understandings are embedded in any processes of rewilding. So it's not really my research that I'm building on there. My research is historical, based in the colonial period, but it has led me to read some of these things, which I think are interesting and might help you find your way to your own judgment on those arguments.
Awesome. Thank you.
Jason, go ahead.
Yeah, Jonathan, I maybe this is more of a comment than a question. I hope it can wind its way into something coherent. I'm always so struck by the caption underneath the figure of the UZ and the collapse of the human body into the animal body, and I see an analysis of that as such an important corrective to the kind of short-sighted idealism of critical animal studies, post-humanism, etc. It signals to us a form of dehumanization that's predicated in race and capital. I'm still trying to maybe someone can help me think through this, because I'm still trying to think through the implications of this. I see this more in cultural formations and literary formations and kind of the work that I do. Like I see this figure popping up over and over again, this subaltern human that is not, that is like constantly rescripted as being dehuman or dehuman in Julietta Sink's formation, or like dehumanized. And sort of crossing this biopolitical boundary into a figure that is animal, but of course cannot be animal, like a kind of subhuman of sorts, and yet it seems to be sharing a biopolitical space with certain animals. So you have, as you so soundly point out, there are these zones of precarity that humans and animals share in certain spaces, but at the same time, we also have to be super attentive to how those zones of exclusion also produce more heterogeneities. Habeas Viscus, another Black Studies scholar, Alexander Lahelia, I think is really good at showing us how this works. I guess I'm just sort of posing this to you, hopefully not unhelpfully. This is kind of where I've been able to get to in thinking through this, but the further implications of it, or kind of how we proceed from here, now that, you know, I think we have this corrective now laid out. How do we, I guess, as critical scholars, how do we productively kind of build on this entanglement, as it were?
So I think it's a great set of provocations. And also, it's really nice to see you again.
Yeah, you too.
Not been in contact for a little bit, but so I think there's lots of different ways we can tackle it, if you like. In that sort of collapse, if you like, or that sort of production of particular shared interspecies vulnerabilities or niches, however we might think of it, is approachable in different ways. And I think there is that breaking down of it and pulling out the implications of what it means for the individuals in terms of representations involved in there. I think there's also something really useful about thinking about it in terms of the commodity fetish as well. And, you know, what is being naturalized here? What relations are being subsumed into the givenness of these bodies? And I think one of the things which is going on here is a particular material relation of labor that is being produced, but also a representation of labor that tries to present it as something other than labor, that tries to present it as love or connection, or even sort of like affiliation or something along those lines. Whereas what actually you have is a process of multi-species labor going on, Now, only part of that labor is recognized as labor, which is the human part of it often, and the animal is reduced to some sort of instinctual thing within that, or a bunch of capacities that can be exploited. In many ways, it's more akin to. Right. Anyway, I talk about this in other ways. I think of it as sort of undead capital in some ways, because it's valued for its living capacities, its abilities as a sentient creature, but is also reduced to being a means of production, in that it requires attendant human labor to produce surplus value, because no elephant is going to extract timber by itself. And so those images are kind of masking or naturalizing those relationships, or figuring them as something slightly different than what they are. So the commodity fetish, I think, might be still a useful way of doing this. And this kind of plugs me into a wider critique I have of colonial animal history in particular, is that it's very attuned to the play of representations, but doesn't deal with that huge powerful set of representations, which is to reduce creatures to monetary values, which is and an animal is the equivalent of so many packets of cigarettes, or there's a world of equivalences of monetary value, that of exchange value, that is a powerful mode of representation that is often overlooked. And this might be obscuring that mode of representation as well. I don't know if that really answers. I think my answer was even less concise than your comment.
I guess I guess what's so difficult about this too is I think we're getting into like really deep like epistemological problems as well, because if you're talking about if you think about this as from a historiographical perspective, then it becomes a question of like, how are these bodies cataloged, and to what end, and what kind of narrative and what kind of story are they telling, and like what are the limits of our methodologies that like permit us to tell that story in a certain way? To what extent might we speculate? So I kind of end up being driven back to, and maybe it's just my bias as like a literary person and like a theory person, where I'm maybe tempted to start putting hermeneutics on things just in order to counter what's present, or to kind of read between the lines, like the subaltern study strategy, right? Like to read between the lines of the archive to try and like infer a counter narrative out of what is not there.
Yeah, so one way of thinking about it, which may be useful, the Spartan studies might be a useful sort of conceit for this, is there's a deconstructive mode you can take to it, and there's a recuperative mode of narrative you could take to it. And I think the important thing to note is, first of all, we can't take what Ranajit Guha does for peasants and apply that directly to elephants or any other creature. There's the logic of encodement is completely different, and also the notion of difference is very different. Subaltern studies has a very particular sort of recursive understanding of differentiation which operates within there, and animal studies has a much more sort of ontological understanding of difference between humans and animals. Oftentimes, if you take someone like Vincent Dupre or Donna Haraway would be a classic example. There is a real, if you like, difference that exists there, even within those entanglements, right? There's a bridging which is being done. Whereas in subaltern studies, the differences are always epistemological, they're always being made, right? But anyway, I think there's a narrative approach we can take to this, which might be different. So one of the things I do in a piece that it should be coming out in the Transactions of Royal Historical Society is to instead think of animals as something as elephants, particularly as organisms within ecosystems. And so when we are aware and thinking about what it is an elephant does in a jungle in Burmese forest, and what happens to their lives under British imperialism, all of a sudden you can see the effects, the cascade effects, the impacts on all other different types of creatures who don't appear in the archive otherwise. What does it mean if elephants don't travel across the world, across Myanmar anymore, and they're located in specific areas or confined to specific areas? What it means is less breeding spaces for amphibians, for instance. It means there's less dung and less quality dung for dung beetles and other creatures that live off that dung. You've got all these ecological effects that cascade out of it. And all that I'm really sort of doing here is taking that, not deconstructing the colonial representation so much, as just putting a different narrative on what materially happens to elephants. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, and it sounds like you're talking about networks too, or like theories of networks, and that helps us to adjust. No, I think that's absolutely right, because it helps us to adjust our interpretation in a way that still isn't necessarily like so speculative, but it reframes the question in a way that still challenges the assumptions both, like, I guess, overly deterministic animal histories or even animal historiographies might be imposing on those movements of bodies, at the same time as it troubles what I see as a real critical and urgent and ongoing error in animal studies that tends to be overly utopian and really and often very race blind. And it can also be like quite ahistorical, and it'll go off on this ontological tangent, but in doing so it'll abstract itself out of the material conditions of the world. So yeah, I think it seems like an emphasis on entanglements and networks in that way can be really useful in reframing some of these questions. So yeah, thanks. I'll stop hogging the floor.
I mean, what I would say, I mean, I want other questions to come in, but rather than entanglements and networks, the concepts I was using was accumulations and cascades, because those have historical dynamics. They have a temporality to them, that I think the flatter notions of entanglements and networks don't necessarily have that movement across time built into it, don't necessarily have that dynamics. But anyway, that's another paper. So yeah.
Thank you both for that, the question and the answer. That was very, I took a lot of notes at least. Ishan, I think you have a question. Go ahead.
Yeah. Am I audible and everything? All right. Yes. Yeah. Thank you for your talk. That was super fascinating. I think that's exactly the kind of work that like animal studies and animal history should be doing right now. And yeah, I just wanted to pick up on the sort of entanglement question that sort of you and Jason went back and forth on. And I know in some of your sort of earlier work, you're interested in thinking about this problem of animal agency through entanglements. And my question was just like, have your thoughts on agency sort of shifted or developed in relation to maybe a turn to racial capitalism or the turn to like accumulation and cascade, as you were mentioning earlier?
To be honest, to be completely, I mean, it's being recorded, so maybe I shouldn't be too frank, but to be completely honest, that particular piece I think you're referring to, the colonizing elephants article, the special issue was about animal agency. I wasn't particularly interested in animal agency. It's like a core part of that piece, but I ended up, when the reviews came back, I ended up writing some of that back into it to address those questions. I don't find the question of agency particularly useful for a lot of things. So it's two things. So first of all, I think sometimes the question of agency is insufficiently disentangled from the question of subjective experience. So animal subjectivity, I think, needs to be dealt with separately from animal agency. It's possible that animals could have subjective experience of things without really having anything like any meaningful sort of forms of agency in their particular set of arrangements that they're in. It's also possible that we can identify animal agency without knowing anything about their subjective experience. And I think sometimes those two things are not disentangled sufficiently in how people write about these things. has my current work got me thinking about agency in different ways? I think to the extent that what I've been trying to look for are concepts for writing historical processes and the effects of historical processes that do not rely upon an implicit notion of agency as it was configured in an old-fashioned more way of rational individuals making decisions and having effects, if that makes sense. And accumulation allows me to do that because what it has is this notion of accumulation having its own logic and dynamic and creating subject positions within itself that encourage people to behave in particular types of ways that is beyond their immediate control, if that makes sense. So in a sort of, or even in an old-fashioned Marxian sense of it, an unreconstructed Marxian sense of it, accumulation has that dynamic, right? You are compelled to speculate in a variety of ways and to try and realize an expanded value. Cascades, whether it's trophic cascades or a more expansive notion of cascades in ecology, also has that thing, right? Something happens to one species or happens to one part of an ecosystem, and it has effects, and no particular creature is responsible in a sort of old-fashioned agentic way for those effects. But what I like about accumulation and cascade, as I've already said to Jason, is that they have a temporal dynamic to them. There's stuff happening over time that occurs and very quickly moves beyond the remit of the agency of any particular actor in a network, right? And but that's me putting that concern in a new lens that I've developed. It's not something which I've necessarily been consciously thinking about, as I've not been writing about or thinking about agency very prominently since that article. And I don't know, some of it's sort of a lazy response to it. It's just like, oh, it just feels so well written about, to put it kindly.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Jason, again.
Yeah, it's funny. I disagree, but in a really sort of good way. I think because I remember that article, and I actually thought it was very. I thought your arguments about it were very compelling, because what you're saying is, well, I mean, you already kind of precisely laid it out, but you're pointing us to how a certain collectivity of bodies faced with, set of X constraints are then responding to those constraints. Humans, as phenomenologically trapped entities to a certain extent, then have to interpret those effects. And part of that act of interpretation, I guess it comes out it comes out partly in us assuming agency, which is, it's an error, but it's a productive error, because it brings us to a more nuanced explanation, I guess, or a more nuanced interpretation of what's actually happening. And then once we can get to that more nuanced interpretation, we can then in turn start to get to that fundamental question of what is it that we're to do with animals? Or
Sure. I agree with all of that. But that wasn't sort of me though, right? I mean, there was a whole swathe of scholarship that I was just basically, citing on, building on to understand the particular arrangements around Burmese elephants in their history. But that type of argument that, there's entangled material relations between different agental actors that create the effect in humans of them believing that they have some level of agency and interpreting the world through that, is fine. and I agree with you, it does enable us to frame our questions in a much more precise and interesting way. But does that insight in and of itself tell us anything about historical phenomenon that is explanatory or causative? And not necessarily. It's part of the scaffolding that helps us get there. But I think so many people have now said it and made that argument in different forums and in different ways, all of which are, you know, interesting and helpful nuances. But I think we've got to the point where it's almost banal,
Right.
to put it in a blunt sense. It's almost banal that that's how agency is operating, and the effects that it has. The agency is an effective particular form of material arrangements. And what's interesting when we take that as a given, and where do we go from there? And what processes can we identify and extract? And actually, does that insight help us produce those different narratives, those different assessments of human-animal relationships, or not? And I think it does in some areas of questioning, but in other scales of analysis and in other research questions, it's useful to have as your baseline, but it doesn't actually, it's not active in the interpretations I make always. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
I don't see any more questions.
Can I quickly just butt in for a moment? Dr. Saad, first of all, thank you so much for this talk. There was, I've taken copious notes as well. There's so many things to actually like read up on, and yeah, thanks once again. There's one tiny little thing which I would like to know more about, the monkey tika, if I'm pronouncing it right. I mean, I found that fascinating. Okay, I mean, it's brilliant. I just wanted to know something. From what I gather, I can always see a proto-posthumanist strain already there, the way I can, I mean, if I understood what it is about, and that fascinating example that you spoke of. I just wanted to know, what is the tone of that thing? Is it consciously, you spoke about subversion, so is it consciously adversarial in that sense, or is it subtly ironic and just like let it be as such? What's the author doing there?
So in that particular section is more subtly ironic, so far as I can discern. I mean, humor in other cultures is such a hard thing, and like I'm not Burmese. I've learned the language in later life, and I've never lived there for extensive periods of time. So there's gaps in my interpretation that I can't fill. I don't have the skill set to fill, but it's subtle. I mean, it's definitely subtle, and he's definitely I'm pretty sure he's going for the humor in this. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff like about how when gorillas will become, they've got the possibility to be civilized, and when you can see this because they can learn to ride bicycles and smoke cigars, and like this equivalence of what civilized is quite clearly sort of satirizing modern behavior in colonial Myanmar. So there's all sorts of things where you can say, this is a bit on the nose, this is definitely humor. The rest of the tone, though, a large portion of this is not really about or directly about monkeys. The implication of monkey behavior is there always because of the sort of framing of it. But basically, there's kind of lots of different poems in there, that some of which are more overtly political and adversarial. Now, if we take one of his other tikas, the dog tika, that is much more adversarial. And that is just like, you know, this set of Burmese nationalists who are working with the British, you are sort of slave dogs. And this is the way that dogs should behave. So this will help you be better dogs for the lap dogs for the British. Like it's less subtle in that way. But then other passages in there have really clear, thoughtful understandings of evolutionary theory, in ways that are more sophisticated than you see in other areas of popular writings on evolution in Burma at the time, where he's aware of different trajectories of what's going on, the importance of particular ecological niches and arrangements. It's not a sort of linear pattern that's going on. So there's really, they're just fascinating bricolage texts, which I find particularly interesting because it is, very much a Western print artifact, but the literary structure of it is Burmese. It's Theravada Buddhist, which is fascinating as well. Yeah, just really, really interesting. I wish I had the linguistic ability to do justice to these texts.
Yeah. No, but you have brought it up. I mean, this is brilliant. And it is really interesting. Yeah, I agree with you. Thanks for that again.
We are sitting at our roughly hour 20 mark for the time that we had allotted. I'm happy to stay and assign people that want to ask questions, but otherwise, if nobody has any other questions, perhaps we can wrap it up as well.
Well, if questions do come to people, then feel free to email me. I always try and answer them. I may not be particularly prompt, but I will get back to you eventually. If there are no more questions, that might be nice for me because I can run down and help cook dinner for the kids over here because our time frames are very different. But thank you everyone for your for sitting and listening to me, and for the really thoughtful conversation which we've had. I've enjoyed it.
And thank you to you, Dr. Saha, for your talk and for all the people that attended and asked questions. This was an excellent talk. Thank you so much again. Okay, and again, just to remind everyone, our email addresses are in the chat if you have any questions about the Animal Studies Reading Group as such. But once again, thank you.